Hi, this is Kristen, and I'm continuing talking about the Open Educational Resource, Chapter 6 on bone tissue. Earlier, I talked about the major functions of the skeletal system. I talked about red and yellow marrow and where they're located and at what age you'll find these things in a skeleton, the age of the skeleton, that is. Talked about the bone classes based on shape and the functions of each. Talked about the gross anatomy of a long bone. I compared periosteum and endosteum, and we looked at the gross anatomy of a flat bone, which is the typical structure for everything but the long bone. And then we looked at the microscopic structure of bone and the different types of cells found within them. Compared compact and spongy bone, and we talked a little bit about the osteon and spongy bone. And then I mentioned Paget's disease, and we talked about the blood and nerve supply to a long bone, and then finally bone markings. And all of this was covered in a class lecture that was given in Hermiston on Monday earlier this week, which would have been October 8th. And so I want to pick up and continue on from there. And so we're going to start off talking about two ways that bones develop, or two ways that we develop our skeleton when we're in the womb going through pre-birth development. And so there are basically two ways that we can make our skeleton. One of them is intramembranous ossification. Intra is within, membranous refers to a membrane, and ossification is bone formation. So it's basically within a membrane bone formation. The second major way that we produce bones is endochondral ossification. Endo is inside or inner, chond is cartilage. So basically, we form bones from within cartilage. Basically, in this way, our bones replace a cartilage template of our skeleton. So we'll talk about these two things, and we're going to start with intramembranous ossification. And so if you look at the picture in the upper left, the first picture basically shows the inside of a developing bone. And the MC, these are mesenchymal cells, which are stem cells that can develop into connective tissue. And so the MC represents the mesenchymal cells. The little squiggly lines represent collagen fibers. An ossification center is where bone first develops. That's represented by OC, shown in the blue. This whole circular area, this big blue circle, is the ossification center. Osteoid are these little orange dots. Osteoid is uncalcified extracellular matrix, but it includes organic components like protein, fibers, and cells. And then OB represents osteoblasts. So these are the active immature cells that are secreting ground substance. Okay, so early embryonic development happens when an embryo skeleton develops from sheets of mesenchymal connective tissue. And mesenchymal connective tissue, again, is undifferentiated. It hasn't yet decided what it's going to become. And the intramembranous ossification forms flat bones of the face, most of the cranial bones, and the clavicles. And so this type of bone formation doesn't happen everywhere. Ossification starts at about week 6 or 7, and remember the embryonic period is from conception through week 8. Okay, so we're going to focus on intramembranous ossification first of these two osteogenic pathways. And in the first picture, it shows how mesenchymal cells gather and they begin to differentiate into specialized cells. For example, they could become capillaries in the bone, or osteoblasts, or osteogenic cells. Early osteoblasts form in a cluster, and that's what's called that ossification center. And then osteoblasts secrete osteoid, that uncalcified matrix with organic components. And the osteoblasts secrete the osteoid, and the mineral salts are then deposited. And then it calcifies in a matter of a few days. The matrix hardens and it traps the osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts become osteocytes, which are the mature inactive bone cells. Osteogenic cells in the surrounding connective tissue differentiate into osteoblasts at the edge of the growing bone. And you can see that happening in the picture to the right, which would be right here. And so here we have osteoid. Actually, I'm going to switch to my little, so this would be the osteoid in here. The osteoblast cells are these cells around the perimeter. The osteocyte is this big cell with looks like it has tentacles. And then the new bone matrix is shown in this kind of gray area. So that's what's happening in this picture. That basically the matrix is set up or hardened, and then the osteogenic cells at the outside here have basically differentiated into osteoblasts. And so that's what we're seeing around the perimeter. Okay, then we can go to the third picture, which would be over here. And in this picture, we see mesenchyme. So this would be the mesenchyme here. And it is forming the periosteum. And that is that connective tissue with two layers that encapsulates the bone, basically. Except it's not present where the hyaline cartilage is. And these cells here are osteoblasts. This strut right here, that is a trabecula. Oops. So this would be the trabecula here. And then, of course, the red is the blood vessel. And in this picture, you're seeing clusters of osteoid form around the capillaries. And it makes a trabecular matrix. The osteoblasts on the surface of the new spongy bone become the periosteum, specifically the inner osteogenic cellular layer. And so that's what you're seeing on the upper and lower parts of this little square image here. Okay, then we're going to go to the fourth picture over here. In this picture, periosteum, okay, so this is the fibrous periosteum right here. These are osteoblasts, that layer of cells there. Okay, we have compact bone here and here. That's the compact bone. And then, of course, we have spongy bone in the center with cavities that contain red bone marrow. And periosteum is secreting compact bone superficial to the spongy bone. The spongy bone crowds the blood vessels, and those condense into the red bone marrow. So the blood vessels become the red bone marrow. And then the bone is remodeled constantly by osteoblasts and osteoclasts. So basically, the remodeling team includes bone builders and bone cells that break down the bone. So that's basically how it works. And you end up with a spongy bone sandwich, which is basically diploa. So you end up with the center spongy bone being referred to as diploid, and then you've got your compact bone here, and your compact bone here, and then this is the spongy bone here. Yeah. All right. So that would be how we'd form a flat bone. So let's go ahead and look at endochondral ossification. Endochondral ossification includes 5 basic steps. First of all, endochondral ossification is when bone replaces hyaline cartilage. Cartilage basically serves as a model or a template for long bones and bones at the base of the skull. So this is how we form all of our long bones, and it takes a lot longer than the intramembranous ossification. So hyaline cartilage, we've already talked about. It's a flexible, semi-solid connective tissue matrix. It contains collagen fibers, a lot of water, hyaluronic acid, chondroitin sulfates. We mentioned all of that. I did a little talk on connective tissue, which is section 4.3, and I give you background on cartilage and bone and other connective tissues, and that's something you're going to be responsible for knowing, so I recommend you listen to that talk that was done similar to this one. It'll be on YouTube, and you can access it from the course website. So basically, chondroblasts secrete the matrix, which becomes the cartilage. The matrix surrounds the chondroblasts, and they become chondrocytes. And so that's very similar to how bone is formed. Just remember that cartilage is avascular, and bone is very vascular. So cartilage has to rely on getting nutrients through diffusion. Nutrients diffuse through the matrix of cartilage from the vessels and the surrounding perichondrium. And the perichondrium is analogous to the periosteum. It's a connective tissue membrane that covers or basically encapsulates the cartilage. Okay, so in this image, what you're seeing is you're seeing a hyaline cartilage here. So this outer area is the perichondrium that surrounds or encapsulates the cartilage, and this is hyaline cartilage. And then this inner part is just the hyaline cartilage. So we have the perichondrium and the hyaline cartilage. And so the mesenchymal cells differentiate into chondrocytes, basically chondroblasts and then chondrocytes. And they produce this cartilage model of what will be the future long bones of the bony skeleton. Then the blood vessels on the edge of the cartilage, right here, they bring osteoblasts, and they deposit a bony collar. And so what you're seeing on the very inside, these kind of dark gray dots, this is the calcified matrix, and then the light gray is the uncalcified matrix. We have the perichondrium surrounding the ends of this cartilage bone, and then this part right here, this represents the bony collar. So this is where we have the first bone. And you can see it on both sides. This is the bony collar right here. And that's all because the blood brought the osteoblasts that secreted the bone. So the capillaries penetrate the cartilage, and they deposit this bone inside the cartilage model, which you can see right here. And this forms what is called the primary ossification center. So the very first place inside the cartilage skeleton that you lay down bone is called the primary ossification center. Now you can really see the primary ossification center right here. It's the center part of the bone. So we'll call this the primary ossification center. Primary is indicated by that 1 degree sign. Okay? This is going to be, that primary ossification is forming spongy bone. We have our bony collar here with periosteum on the outside, and then we have perichondrium right there on the outside of that cartilage skeleton. Okay, so this is step 3, this is step 2, and this is step 1. And you can find the labeled image inside the book. Okay, so we're going to move to the 4th picture. Here, this is uncalcified matrix found in this area here. That's uncalcified matrix. This is calcified matrix here. Here we have the beginning of the medullary cavity, and I want to talk about how that forms. And then, of course, we can see the nutrient artery and a vein penetrating into the inside of the bone. And then we have the periosteum on the outside of the bone collar. Okay, how is it that we got this medullary cavity? Well, the bone collar, the cartilage and the chondrocytes, continue to grow at the ends of the bones, which you can see here, while the medullary cavity is expanding and remodeling. How we get the medullary cavity is that this bony collar around the superficial part of the diaphysis, the shaft, it prevents nutrients from diffusing to the center of the hyaline cartilage, and so the chondrocytes on the inside of the diaphysis die. And the center of this cartilage disintegrates, and then blood vessels can more easily penetrate the shaft of the bone because they're not blocked by cartilage. And this enlarges the space. The vessels bring in osteogenic cells, some of which become osteoblasts, and that enlarging space becomes the medullary cavity. The primary ossification center basically forms from the osteoblasts, and this whole process continues after birth. But I guess the main reason that we get this medullary cavity is because initially the bone collar prevents nutrients from diffusing to the center of the hyaline cartilage, and without the nutrients, the cartilage dies. Okay, so if we move to step 5, what you can see in step 5, which would be in this picture here, you can see that we are developing secondary ossification centers. So this would be a secondary ossification center. We have an artery and a vein penetrating the epiphysis. This dark gray area here is uncalcified matrix, and then this is our original nutrient artery and vein. And what's happening is the secondary ossification center is forming. And so this is a second center for laying down bone, and this actually happens after birth. So this is post-birth where this is occurring. And the very last step, step 6, here we can see that the hyaline cartilage remains at the epiphyseal end, and this is called the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate. So we have a little section of hyaline cartilage that separates the end of the bone from the shaft, or the epiphysis from the diaphysis. And that continues into early adulthood depending on the bone. And you'll find the growth plate or the epiphyseal plate at the joint surfaces. And so that's how we make long bones. Again, it takes a little longer than intramembranous ossification, and it's called endochondral ossification because we're basically forming bone from within cartilage. And that's exactly what happens because we have a primary ossification center in the center of the bone. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and move on. How is it that bones grow longer? Well, what they've done in this picture is they've taken the end of a bone here. This looks like a femur. This is the proximal end of the femur. And they have just expanded that epiphyseal plate. And so this is showing an epiphyseal plate. And so it's important to note when we're looking at this that this would be the epiphyseal side, the proximal epiphysis, and this would be the diaphyseal side. I think that's what's most important to note. Also, I think it's important to note that this general area here, this is the area that is producing hyaline cartilage matrix. And this happens to be called the reserve zone, and this happens to be called the proliferative zone. And proliferative means to divide and make more, to proliferate and make more. But what's the big picture here is that we're making new cartilage here. This is the key point. Now, if we look a little bit further down in this area, here what's happening is the cartilage is calcifying. In other words, it's dying and being replaced by bone. Cartilage dies and is replaced by bone. So in other words, the diaphysis is getting longer because the bone is moving this direction, and the cartilage is moving in this direction. And so that's how we lengthen the bone. The epiphyseal plate is essentially responsible for bone lengthening. This is called interstitial growth. This whole process of growing the bone from the inside, essentially, is called interstitial growth, growth from within. So this is interstitial growth. And I'm talking about the whole picture is interstitial growth. So basically what's happening here is that there are this whole area is, these different lines are showing growth plate zones. I told you this was the reserve zone, this is the proliferative zone, this is the hypertrophic zone where things are, hypertrophy is to get bigger. This is the calcification zone, and this is the metaphysis, the ossification zone, where bone is being made. Okay, so basically in this area, from here to here, this is an area where we're producing hyaline cartilage matrix, chondrocytes, which are shown right here, chondrocytes, these little things, in the reserve zone secure the epiphyseal plate to the epiphyseal bone. This right here, these are stacks of slightly larger chondrocytes in the proliferative zone, and new chondrocytes are made through mitosis to replace the ones that die at the at the end of the bone. Here, we have chondrocytes at the zone of maturation and hypertrophy. These chondrocytes are older and much bigger. And you can see that they're much bigger here. They've matured. This, the zone of calcified matrix, is showing chondrocytes, most of which are dead. The surrounding matrix is calcified, restricting the nutrients that are able to reach the chondrocytes through diffusion. So capillaries and osteoblasts from the diaphysis, which you can see here in red, penetrate the zone, and then osteoblasts secrete tissue on the remaining calcified cartilage. And this zone connects the epiphyseal plate to the diaphysis. So basically, bones lengthen into early adulthood, and the rate of growth is controlled by hormones. When chondrocytes in the epiphyseal plate stop proliferating, when they stop increasing in number through mitosis, bone replaces all of the cartilage and longitudinal growth stops. Interstitial growth literally means growth within a tissue. And that's exactly what we're seeing here at the epiphyseal plate with bone lengthening. Just so you know, though, bones don't only grow in length. They also grow in width. I mean, if they didn't grow in both directions, then we'd end up with really skinny bones, and they wouldn't be very thick at all. So, it's worth mentioning that there are actually two ways that the dimensions change. I mentioned interstitial growth is how we get the lengthening, and that happens at the epiphyseal plate. But appositional growth is how we increase the width of the bone. So these are two different things. And appositional growth literally means adding to the free surface. So instead of adding bone inside a structure, we could be laying bone on we could lay bone on the free surface of it. There. Now, keep in mind that we have endosteum here, and we have periosteum where that blue mark is. And so we can add bone in the endosteum and the periosteum, and it's still called appositional growth. They're both free surfaces. So we can add bone here at the free surface, and we can add bone here at the free surface, and it widens the bone. Okay, so the growth and diameter of a bone occurs during lengthening and after lengthening, even when your bones stop growing lengthwise. The remodeling teams again include the osteoblasts and the osteoclasts, and the remodeling occurs throughout life. It occurs from injury, it occurs with exercise, it's happening constantly. About 5 to 10% of your skeleton is remodeled every year. And compact bone and spongy bone remodel at different rates. There is one genetic disease called Osteogenesis Imperfecta, sometimes known as brittle bone disease, and unfortunately there's no cure for it. And this results because there's a decrease in the production of collagen. And so the bones become very fragile, And it doesn't only affect bones. Unfortunately, it can cause fragile skin and weak muscles and loose joints, easy bruising, frequent nosebleeds, brittle teeth. You can even experience hearing loss. And blue sclera, the whites of the eyes can be kind of blue. That just gives you an idea of how many places in the body where we have collagen fibers. Okay, next thing I wanted to talk about were fracture types. So, fracture types, we have a whole bunch of different fracture types shown here. This shows a normal femur bone. And a closed reduction is if you break a bone and it comes out of alignment, as you can see in some of these pictures. You have to reset the bone, otherwise it will heal in the improper position. It won't be aligned. And if you reset a bone non-surgically, that's called a closed reduction. A closed reduction would be if they popped your bone back into place with no surgery. No surgery. An open reduction is when they have to actually reset it surgically. Reset surgically. A fracture can be minor or serious. There can be all sorts of complications. The most serious fracture would be a fracture of the femur. The femur is the largest, longest, strongest bone in the body. And if you, for example, fractured the femoral diaphysis, which they're showing in this picture here, that first one, that can actually lead to fat globules coming out of the yellow bone marrow, getting into the blood, and traveling into the lung capillaries and causing a pulmonary embolism, which is basically like a clot in the lungs, and that can actually be fatal. Also, fractures can actually sever major arteries, like the femoral artery, for example. If you had a fracture that severed the femoral artery, you could bleed to death. So fractures can be serious, and they're classified by complexity and location. And when we're looking at this image here, this first one here, whoops, this first one is an open fracture. Sometimes that is called a compound fracture. And a compound fracture is when the bone actually breaks the surface of the skin from the inside. I actually had a compound fracture once, and it bled, and it was very painful. So it can be called open or compound. This picture shows a closed fracture, and a closed fracture is when the skin remains intact. So this is an example of where the skin surface is not penetrated by the bone. The next type of fracture, this one right here, this would be called an oblique fracture. And the reason it's called oblique is because the fracture occurs at an angle that is not 90 degrees. It's kind of a diagonal oblique break. If this is the long axis of the bone, it's an oblique fracture. And then this next image to the right, this is called a comminuted. A comminuted fracture is one where there are several breaks that form a bunch of small pieces between two large segments. So here are all the small pieces in the middle of the bone. This one here is a spiral fracture, and this typically happens from a twisting motion. I actually broke my leg backpacking. When I sprained my ankle, I had a backpack on, stepped on a rock, sprained my ankle, and I twisted my ankle. And as I was falling, I heard it snap, and I felt it give. And I knew right away I broke it, and I knew it was a spiral fracture because it was a twisting motion. And spiral fractures are pretty unstable, and I knew that as well. So I immobilized it. I happened to be at over 8,500 feet in the mountains, and it was actually it was kind of an interesting story. Someone had to climb to the top of the peak and use a cell phone to get reception, and they actually got through to another county on the opposite side of the mountains and they called in search and rescue, and they came in the next day on horses and took me out. But the only way we could get reception was to have the person I was with climb up to the top of the peak. It ended up being the highest mountain rescue in Oregon that year. And I'd been backpacking my whole life, so I was kind of embarrassed that I broke my ankle. But anyway, they told me it's lucky I didn't put weight on it because it was so unstable it would have needed a surgical reduction, which would have been the open reduction if I had put any weight on it. So I lucked out. All right, so looking at this next one, this is an example here of an impacted fracture. And the impacted fracture is just when one fragment of a bone is jammed into the other, and it usually happens from compressive forces. So this could happen if someone jumped off from a tall place, jumped off a building or something. The next image shows a green stick image, and this typically happens with people who have a lot of cartilage still in their skeleton. This would be what would occur in a child, for example, where the bone is still kind of green. It still has a lot of collagen. It reminds me of literally of a green stick, and it just fractures on one side of the bone, and the other side remains intact. The last type is the transverse fracture. The transverse fracture is basically when the break occurs straight across the long axis of the bone. So the break is at a right angle. Right. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about bone healing. Bone healing, and then I think I'll stop then for a moment here after this, and so I don't make the video too long. But with bone healing, broken blood vessels leak blood that clots into a fracture hematoma. So obviously we know bone is really vascular. And if we break the bone right here, we break all those blood vessels. So we get a fracture hematoma in this first image. Then we form an internal and an external callus, which is made of cartilage and bone. So the internal cartilage is in the center of the bone, and the external callus is on the outer surfaces of the bone, made up of cartilage and bone. Then the cartilage of the calluses is gradually eroded, and that's what we're seeing in this third image here. The cartilage is then replaced by trabecular bone. It's actually technically it's called woven bone. It's kind of a disorganized spongy bone. So this makes this bony callus here, which we can see right here. And then remodeling takes place over time. And the remodeling replaces the immature woven bone with the mature bone. And it can remain kind of a little bit swollen there for a while. But what's important to note is in this particular stage here, when you have these calluses made up of cartilage and bone, within about 48 hours, the stem cells from the endosteum differentiate into chondrocytes, chondroblasts, and then they secrete fibrocartilaginous matrix that unites the bone. So initially, we're using cartilage to unite the bone, and then the periosteal chondrocytes and the osteoblasts are what creates the external callus of the cartilage and bone. Here, osteoclasts resorb that dead bone, and osteogenic cells divide and they differentiate into osteoblasts. Cartilage is replaced by the spongy bone through endochondral ossification, which is basically destruction of cartilage and replacement by bone. And then the bone forms that bony hard callus. Here, the compact bone replaces the spongy bone at the outer margins. And then the more weight bearing that a person does, the strain actually promotes this remodeling. So that's why they put people in a walking cast, because the stress and strain put on the bone promotes healing. So that's basically fracture repair, and it takes quite a while. I mean, depending on the severity of the break. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop here before we talk about the last bit of this chapter. And we'll have a separate little talk about that.